Yasser Arafat poisoned to death? An Al Jazeera Commission study found shocking information on the PLO leader's demise. Consider this: what does it mean, and who are the likely suspects? Also, the NFL taken to task over alleged cases of bullying. Rookie hazing has been a pro football tradition for decades. So when does it cross the line from pranks to outright abuse? And what's it like to be a witness to one of the most notorious trials in history from behind a sketchbook? The author and artist of Sketching Guantanamo will join us. Hello, I'm Antonio Mora. Welcome to Consider This. We begin with an Al Jazeera exclusive. A Swiss study commissioned by Al Jazeera has found strong evidence indicating Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat had been poisoned with a rare radioactive element, polonium-210, when he died in November of 2004. As Al Jazeera's Clayton Swisher reports, the study supports the theory that the polonium poisoning caused Arafat's death.
First, they found abnormally high amounts of polonium-210 in Yasser Arafat's clothes. Now, they've discovered a high presence of the radioactive substance inside his bones. Swiss scientists produced this 108-page report after an exhumation of Arafat's body last November. The scientists say their data clearly favors polonium poisoning with up to 83% confidence. The Arafat family received the results from their lawyer, along with an analysis from Professor of Forensic Science, David Barkley.
If I was a judge and jury, this is absolutely stone cold certain. This is beyond any doubt, in my opinion, that it was polonium that caused the death of Yasser Arafat.
For widow and daughter, it is 100% proof.
When they came with the results, I'm mourning Yasser again. As he told me he just died. I will not stop. Me and my daughter will go to all courts in all over the world to punish who did this crime.
Now that I have proof that he was poisoned, I feel a bit relieved. I feel relieved, actually. A final closure for me will be knowing who killed him and the motive and the ambition behind it.
More than 40 years of research have given scientists knowledge of the average levels of polonium and radioactive lead in human skeletons. But what was found in Arafat's ribs and hips was the highest ever published.
And everybody has a very tiny amount of polonium in their bones. The level of polonium in Yasser Arafat is about 900 millibecquerels. That is either 18 or 36 times the average, depending on the literature.
What's more, the soil around his body had absorbed his decaying flesh and organs. That soil also measured at least 18 times higher than earth not visibly stained. The report rules out any external contamination, and it confirms through DNA testing that the skeleton was definitely Arafat's. On a scale of confidence 1 to 6, 6 being strongly confident, the scientists say the data support poisoning at level 5. These results confirm a theory of polonium poisoning first put forward last year. Then, the same Swiss scientists found that Arafat's blood and urine stains were strongly contaminated with polonium-210, including polonium in its purest reactor-made form. They were lifted from the stained clothes the Palestinian leader wore in his final days. But this latest test was on Arafat's flesh and bones, buried in Ramallah since his death in 2004. The samples were gathered when his body was unearthed in November last year. 3 teams took 20 samples each. Al Jazeera has released the Swiss team's results. A Russian team also carried out tests after a last-minute invite from the Palestinian Authority. Their results have not yet been made public. And there was a team in France.
The French results remain a secret, but as 3 investigating magistrates continue with the murder inquiry, they now have new evidence. And the looming question beyond all of this is whether the Palestinian Authority shifts the case to the International Criminal Court. Perhaps then Miss Arafat and her daughter will finally see suspects brought to trial and learn once and for all not just what killed Yasser Arafat, but who. Clayton Swisher, Al Jazeera, Paris.
A little perspective on Yasser Arafat. He led the Palestinian Liberation Organization for decades and became the face of the Palestinian movement throughout the world. After decades of attacks, he was viewed as a terrorist by Israel and many Western nations. While the U.S. had behind-the-scenes contacts with the PLO, Washington refused to deal with Arafat in public. But in 1993, the PLO recognized Israel, and Arafat shook hands with Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in an unforgettable moment on the White House lawn. Over the next decade, Arafat returned to Gaza and the West Bank, but his relationship with both Israel and the U.S. deteriorated, particularly after the start of the Second Palestinian Uprising in 2000. By the time of Arafat's death, Israel again saw him as a terrorist, and Washington would have little to do with him. For more on all this, I'm joined from Denver by Nader Hashemi. He is an associate professor and director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. And here in New York, in the studio, is Ahmed Shihab-Eldin, host and producer for HuffPost Live, a Palestinian American and a former co-host of Al Jazeera English's award-winning show, The Stream. Great to have you both with us. Ahmed, I want to start with you. What was your response when you heard the news? There's no question that poisoning was suspected back in 2004 when Arafat died.
I have to be clear with you about my reaction, which is that I was not surprised. This is the biggest non-story story, essentially, especially in the sense that first there was the investigation by Al Jazeera. Of course, the experts said they're 83% confident now, and we heard, the statistics that it was either 18 or 36, times in terms of, depending on the literature, in terms of how much polonium was in him. I think what troubled me was that the questions that really matter still remain at large, which is what the motive was and who it was that actually did this. Because without that, there's going to be no accountability. And of course, everyone is saying, including Arafat's wife, that we should not be pointing fingers. But the fingers have long been pointed, for example, at Israel and some of the other factions within the Palestinian leadership. The most important thing, I think, to focus on is accountability. Obviously, the time frame limits us in terms of it being 9 years ago, in terms of finding bank transfers and all of that. That would probably give us more answers.
Well, let's talk about some of the different angles here. Suha Arafat, Yasser Arafat's widow, had this to say on Wednesday morning about the Al Jazeera report.
I'm full of anger. This is a crime. This is an assassination of an elected Palestinian leader by his people. It's a political assassination.
And Palestinians in Hebron, interviewed by the Agence France Presse, blamed Israel. But Nader, Arafat certainly had a lot of other enemies around the region. As we heard Ahmed say, there were questions about his inner circle even. And according to the New York Times, there were attempts on Arafat's life, perhaps 40 attempts, not just from Israel.
Well, yeah.
Well, that's correct. That's correct, but those attempts on his life really happened at an earlier phase of his existence. I mean, in the final days when he was killed or when he passed away, he was surrounded by close allies and close confidants, or seemingly close confidants, and it was really the Israelis who had control over the environment in which he lived. So if anyone is responsible, it would seem like it would be the Israelis, particularly the Sharon government, who had an interest in trying to remove him from.
Although he was holed up in Ramallah on the West Bank in a presidential compound, so it's not like the Israelis really had that much access to him directly.
Well, he was besieged in the sense that they were surrounding his compound, and it's worth pointing out that Prime Minister Olmert, the Deputy Prime Minister Olmert, had said that he would consider killing him. And there were attempts, for example, in 1985 at the headquarters in Tunisia, again in 1982 in Lebanon, and then again in Ramallah, a decade or two later.
All right, let's go back in time. Let's talk about what was said back then. Former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's spokesman today insisted that Israel didn't do it, saying, I quote, it was government decision not to touch Arafat at all. If anyone poisoned him, it could have been someone from his inner circle. But back in 2003, as you said, when Arafat was confined in that Ramallah compound, Israeli Vice Prime Minister Ehud Olmert said, killing him is definitely one of the options. We are trying to eliminate all the heads of terror, and Arafat is one of the heads of terror. So both of you, Nader, are you convinced that it had to be Israel?
Well, I mean, they would be the ones who could pull off an operation like this. I mean, it's not that, like they haven't done this before to Palestinian leaders. I think there was a personal animosity that Sharon and his advisors had toward Arafat because Arafat symbolized resistance to Israel, symbolized Palestinian nationalism. So I think there's a motive there that one can point to. But ultimately, I think we don't know. I don't think we're going to be able to have a direct linkage between who administered the polonium and whether you can trace it back to the state of Israel. But I think in the minds of Palestinians, there's a general consensus that yes, it was Israel that was responsible for his death.
Let's listen to Suha Arafat again. She said something else about the report.
I don't know a lot of countries that have nuclear reactors in the world. I mean, to find this substance of polonium, which is rare and which is only done in reactors, and to kill him with it.
Now, Israel, of course, has a nuclear reactor, but Russia has a whole bunch, and the only person we know of who was definitely killed in a polonium attack is Alexander Litvinenko. He's a Russian dissident who was killed in England when Russian agents allegedly put polonium into his tea at a Russian hotel. Now, Nader, doesn't that muddy the trail, at least where Israel is concerned?
Not really, because you have to ask yourself in times like this, who benefits the most from removing Arafat? Does Russia benefit or does Israel benefit? And I think it's pretty clear that Israel benefits much more than Russia does.
And one thing that we should add is, this type of polonium is largely manufactured in Russia. And a lot of people are raising the question, rightfully, why there was no autopsy done when he traveled to France and, he was there for 2 weeks or, something like that. And there was no autopsy done. His wife didn't request it and they didn't conduct it. Now, if there had been 40 previous attempts, as Arafat himself had said, you would think that that would be something that would be important to do.
But also, interestingly, back then, he was taken to France for treatment, and that is where he died. But also, the PLO, Nader, didn't want the autopsy either.
That's a good question. I mean, you would expect that given the stature of Arafat and given the sort of, mysterious circumstances around his death, that there would be an autopsy. Who made that decision, I think, would have to be part of any serious investigation into the root causes of his death.
And if I can add, just the biggest challenge is the timeline. It's important to note it's been 9 years, and that makes it more difficult, as I mentioned, to track this. It obviously was a sophisticated murder attempt, if it was in fact a murder, as the results show. And I think we have to raise questions as to why we heard from the Russian experts recently, suggesting that there was no indication that polonium was involved. Of course, Russia.
Right, because the Russians and the French are also looking at this 9 year later autopsy of Arafat, and there was an initial report that one of the Russians said, oh no, we didn't find any polonium, but then they took it back.
Right, and it's a 108-page report. Now it's going to be translated and it's going to be passed along in French, by a translation service. But what I find curious is, even if this was done amongst the Palestinian leadership, what is going to come of this? It's just going to be a reminder, a sobering reminder, if you will, of how divided the Palestinian leadership is. If Israel is implicated, there are not going to be, or not likely, I should say, to be any real punitive measures taken, because as we see logistics on the ground, settlements continue to be expanded, continue to be annexed. I mean, the logistics don't warrant any sort of indication that peace is likely in terms of the reality. So what will come of this, unless Israel is implicated, though the biggest possible success in terms of the peace process itself and the end of occupation would be a galvanized movement towards unity, because the collective subconscious, the collective consciousness, if you will, hails him as a symbol of resistance.
Well, Nader, what kind of consequences do you think it'll have? John Kerry, Secretary of State, was meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu this week in Israel. Do you think this will cause any more problems for the peace talks? They certainly don't seem to be going too well from all reports that we've heard.
Well, not in the short term, but if this story stays in the headlines, it could prove very complicating and embarrassing, particularly for the figure of Mahmoud Abbas, because, it'll raise questions. Was this an orchestrated plot to remove Arafat from the scene and replace him by someone who's more compliant, such as Mahmoud Abbas, as a way of advancing Israel's interests in these peace negotiations? So if this drags on, if there's demands for a public inquiry among the Palestinians, if this stays in the headlines, it could make life, particularly for the figure of Mahmoud Abbas, very difficult if he wants to sign onto a peace agreement, which could be perceived by many Palestinians as a capitulation, as caving in and doing something that Arafat refused to do in the Oslo II Accords in 2000. And so I think in that sense it could prove very complicating, particularly for the Palestinian side in these negotiations.
And now on that point, we saw Clayton mention that in terms of a public inquiry, they could have gone, or they could still go to the ICC, and this raises a lot of questions about the strategy of Fatah and the Palestinian Authority, in terms of Mahmoud Abbas choosing instead to negotiate this prisoner release and this exchange. Rather than go to the United Nations, they're eligible now as an observer state to actually apply to 60 agencies, including the ICC, and yet they're only members of UNESCO, which they were members of before they even won observer status. So politically, this does have implications.
Now, this is 9 years later, and while Arafat may have been beloved by Palestinians back then, he's also considered by many around the world as being the father of terrorism, the father of televised terrorism, spectacular attacks by Palestinian groups that he was behind, mostly associated with the PLO, mostly against Israel, brought attention to the Palestinian cause, but killed an awful lot of people. A partial list from the 70s and 80s include airline and bus hijackings, airport attacks, the horrible 1972 Munich Olympic massacre, and the Achille Lauro hijacking, where a disabled American was pushed into the sea to his death. Again, Arafat wound up isolated in a compound. He wasn't nearly as powerful as he was, as he had been toward the end. How do Palestinians now look back on Arafat and his record of violence?
You know, without speaking on behalf of all Palestinians, I mean, it's a great question because it's the key question, but at the same time, I think it's really, again, largely symbolic how people look back at him in terms of him being a symbol of resistance, whether he approached the resistance and trying to end the occupation and bring about peace through violent means or through non-violent measures, whether he was associated with those reports, I think is not irrelevant, but not front and center. What is front and center is that for many years now, as you know, the Palestinian leadership is divided between Fatah and Hamas.
Right.
And so this only brings it home in terms of an emotional, especially amongst his family and those who were close to him. You know, but beyond that, I don't think.
And a division that grew after he died.
Right.
So Arafat's shadow certainly looming over the peace process and over what's going on in the Middle East today. Nader, Ahmed, really appreciate you both joining us tonight, and we'll stay on top of this story. Coming up, bullying hits the NFL hard, but where is the line between fun and games?